We are going to be talking about the Constitution, which is a document that was written 200 years ago and governs your life today, so it is very important. But just a little background in Section 1, there was not a Constitution right at the end of the war. There was actually something called the Articles of Confederation that existed from 76 to 87. It's kind of like our first Constitution. It established a very weak central government, so not much control. Under the Articles, each state had to send a delegation to the capital city, and the delegation was known as the Confederation Congress. There were not separate branches of this particular government at this time. They could declare war, raise armies, and sign treaties, but because they could not impose taxes, they actually couldn't pay for any of this. They couldn't regulate trade, and those were kind of some major issues. They did establish these Western policies. Since the Congress could not tax or regulate trade, the only way the Confederate Congress could raise money to pay its debt was to sell land it controlled west of the Appalachian Mountains. Congress would eventually pass what's called the Northwest Ordinance. It is still very important today, which created more land north of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi. This land could eventually be divided into 3 to 5 states. This ordinance was considered a success of the Articles of Confederation, maybe one of the only ones. It provided for the survey of land in the Ohio, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Indiana, and set up to clear the orderly process by which new states were admitted into the Union on an equal basis. For example, to become a state, a territory, which is what you're called before your state, must have a population of at least 60,000. Ohio was the first state admitted, so it is the 14th state in the Union. Dividing up the land of the state, 36 square meters, very European there, square miles, equals a township. Each township, one of the square miles, the 16th is used for public schools. So you can see this beautiful picture that outlines all of that information for you right there to the right. So you guys can see the Articles of Confederation there to the right. There were the weaknesses at the top. Following the Revolutionary War, Britain imposed harsh trade restrictions on the United States when it came to trade with other British colonies as well as the mainland. To overcome these problems, representatives from the Congress negotiated several trade treaties with other countries, including Poland, Prussia, a place you've never heard of because it doesn't exist today, and Sweden. The United States also had a commercial treaty in place with France. And by the 1790s, the United States was trading was much greater than when they were American colonies. Now think about it. Great Britain owned a strong imperialistic government, controlled most of the world, so restrictions on trade with Great Britain were huge. Due to several states having different tax regulations, the British were able to sell their goods in the new nation. To take advantage of the system, the British would have their goods sent to the states with the lowest taxes and the fewest restrictions. The Congress was unable to regulate trade and commerce, so its states started setting up customs posts at their borders to prevent British from exploiting different trade laws. I know there's a lot of text on this page, but what I really want you to get out of this is the economic crisis. Due to the high cost of fighting the Revolutionary War, the United States went into a severe recession. We just got out of one of those, so you know what that looks like. Farmers were among the group who was most affected. To help pay the debt, each state could raise taxes. Farmers encourage state to print more money. Everybody thinks that printing more money gives you more money, but the money has to be represented by gold to back it up. So just printing money is just making it paper. However, with that idea came problems of inflation. In Rhode Island, among many other states, money had virtually no value. Shays Rebellion, named for Daniel Shay, a veteran of the American Revolution. A full-scale rebellion took place in Massachusetts. The rebellion started when the government of Massachusetts decided to raise taxes and not print more money. These taxes fell heavily on the farmers of Massachusetts, particularly the poor farmers. These farmers struggled with the debt issues, forcing many of them to lose their farms. Angry with the legislature's decision, the farmers revolted and closed down several county courthouses to prevent the farm foreclosures. Daniel Shay would emerge as one of the rebellion's leaders. The rebellion is considered by some the first Civil War in America, but also showed our government how weak the Articles of Confederation were, and basically they could not do anything. So if you look at the bottom, they are too weak because states had all the power. As we begin Section 2, you guys can see that we started to have a new Constitution. So the Constitutional Convention began. It began a little slow, but as you guys could see, there were some genius people that were there. This is February 21st of 1787. The Articles Congress called a convention of state delegates at Philadelphia to propose a plan of government. People who supported the fight for stronger national government were called nationalists. New York delegate Alexander Hamilton recommended that the Congress itself call for another convention to be held in Philadelphia in May of 1787. Every state except Rhode Island sent delegates to what became known as the Constitutional Convention. In May, delegates took their places in Pennsylvania State House. In Philadelphia, 74 delegates were appointed to attend, and 55 delegates showed up. Rhode Island refused to send delegates. But remember, their money was weightless, so they were having some problems. Their main goals were to balance the rights and form a stronger national government. The founders were an elite group of delegates that attended the convention in Philadelphia, included some of the most influential men in Americans' history. The Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan. So these are the two ideas that these guys came up with, and this is what they argue against. So the New Jersey Plan versus the Virginia Plan. New Jersey Plan, one house legislature, equal representation in Congress, supported by smaller states who feared losing power of the federal government, versus the Virginia Plan, two houses of legislature, representation to Congress based on the population, supported by larger states. Now, believe it or not, back then Congress could actually compromise, and it is called the Great Compromise. So if you look below, the Great Compromise establishes two houses of legislature, which is bicameral. One has equal representation based upon everybody gets one person going, or two people going, which is the Senate, and then the House is based upon population, which gives the larger populated states more representatives in the House of Representatives. So in this group of 55 men that met, half had gone to college, which was a staggering amount of educated people at that time, because typically very little went to college, and 40% of them had been in the war. The Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan on this particular slide will show you exactly the two plans and then the Great Compromise. And that's exactly what needs to happen, is this Great Compromise and the way that they broke our government down, which was truly genius at the time. Most people don't realize exactly what an amazing compromise this was. So the Union was built on compromise. The Kinetic Compromise is the Great Compromise. So keep those three states basically separate in your head. Originally, the Congress was going back to the Virginia Plan. Outraged by the decision, the smaller states insisted that they have an equal vote in the matter. Larger states, disgruntled with the opinion, threatened to walk out of the meeting. In an attempt to come to a conclusion, the Congress appointed a special committee to resolve the differences between the states. The delegates selected were as close to impartial as they were to help the situation. The Great Compromise is also called the Kinetic Compromise because Roger Sherman, the delegate from Connecticut, proposed the idea. The Great Compromise ideas of both New Jersey and Virginia. So, and you guys can see some of the annual salaries of the people at the time listed there. So now we're at the piece of the Constitution that is pretty insulting. It's called the Three-Fifths Compromise, another hot topic at the Constitutional Convention. Originally, Benjamin Franklin proposed that one member of the House of Representatives would be elected for every 40,000 people in the state. The proposal caused a split between the North and the South because even though the Southerners didn't think these were people, they still wanted to count them as citizens, even though they weren't going to give them the rights of citizens. The Northerners argued that the enslaved people could not vote. The Northerners also suggested that if the slaves could be counted for representation, they should be counted for purposes of taxation as well. To compromise, the Three-Fifths Compromise was worked out. Every fifth enslaved person in the state would count as three-fifths free persons. Also, as you can see at the bottom, there was the framework for limited government, the idea of checks and balances. And the checks and balances systems prevents any one branch of the government from becoming too powerful. This is very unique to the United States and very, very important. So we needed a system to amend the Constitution because things change, times change, everything changes over time. And so they came up with a way, but they initially started with the first 10 amendments already there, and those are called the Bill of Rights. But here we go, amending the Constitution. When the Constitution was created, the writers realized that there was a possibility that there could be changes made in the document. In order to make it change and live and move, the delegates created a process that should be used. However, making a change to the document was not that easy and was set up that way so that the government could not frequently change. The process created had two-step process called for proposal and ratification of 2/3 vote process in both houses of Congress. So you guys can see kind of different things here based upon that. So once the Constitutional Convention ended, they all went back to their states to push the new Constitution for ratification, which means making something valid by formally ratifying or confirming it. The debates took place in mass meeting and were, if you look they were all in the newspapers about what was going on. So there became two groups that really came out in favor and against this, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And so those eventually become the first two political parties as well. So you guys can see here the two different political groups and who represented them, Federalists and Anti-Federalists. The Federalists were supporters of the Constitution. Many farmers that lived near the coast were supporters of the Constitution. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay were adamant supporters of the Constitution and published a series of writings that persuaded Americans called the Federalist Papers. Anti-Federalists were opponents of the Constitution. The name Anti-Federalist was misleading because most of the men were not truly against federalism. Some prominent figures of the Anti-Federalists included John Hancock, Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee, and George Clinton. So basically, they had to add that Bill of Rights, or a group led by Samuel Adams. Basically, that was they were leading an objection to the Constitution. But once those Bill of Rights were put on there, was complete, Adams decided to vote for ratification, and the final vote of 187 members voted for the Constitution, as opposed to the 168 that voted against it. Once Massachusetts ratified the Constitution, Maryland, South Carolina, and New Hampshire followed suit. However, without Virginia and New York cited in the Constitution process, many feared the new government would not succeed. So there are some famous people that came out of New York. One, of course, is Alexander Hamilton, who is a staunch Federalist. And he managed to delay the final vote in New York until New Hampshire and Virginia had actually ratified the Constitution. The fact that those two states ratified would have put New York in the situation where they would have to fend for themselves while being surrounded by states that had ratified the Constitution. So if you look at the map to the right, you could see some of that. By July of 1788, all states except Rhode Island and North Carolina had ratified the Constitution. And then if you look down to the right, Virginia, in Virginia, George Washington and James Madison presented arguments for ratification to the Virginia Convention. Patrick Henry and Richard Henry Lee, as well as other anti-federalists, made arguments against it, very similar to Massachusetts and Virginia, that ratified the Constitution when the Bill of Rights was added. You can break the Constitution down into these basic three parts. The preamble, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility. Of course, you've all heard that, followed by the 10 Bill of Rights, and then eventually we add 17 amendments, and then the 7 articles that outline how the federal government is to operate, and you could see the different articles written there. I'm not going to read these Bill of Rights, but these are your rights, and you should know them. When somebody says something like, I plead the fifth, it's because an accused person's life, liberty, or property cannot be taken away from them, and that they cannot witness against themselves. Many of these are very famous. Of course, number 1, religion, freedom of religion, assembly, speech, press, and petition. Of course, there are limitations on all of these. Now, here are the 7 articles that are the meat of the Constitution, and it tells you who has power to do what. And that's very important because we want our power spread out in this country. And that's exactly what happens here. Now, to see a nice pretty picture of this, we can also look at Articles 1, 2, and 3 and the breakdown of the 3 branches of government and how that power is spread out amongst those 3 branches of government so that you basically do not get one branch stronger than the other. If you look at the requirements for office, this is broken down in either Article 2, 1, or 3 so that you know exactly your job description and what you need to be like in order to fulfill that particular job. Now, who's president? You guys can download and look back at this slide, but basically you should know there were presidents before George Washington. It's just that George Washington was the first president of the United States under the Constitution and not under the Articles of Confederation. So you guys, it's good to know at least you could win this in a particular game, a Trivial Pursuit, and know that there are presidents before other presidents. But it's more important to know the requirements for office, if you would like to run for office. Of course, the Articles of 1, 2, and 3 and how our power is broken up. Basically what's in the 7 articles, very important to your specific life, are the Bill of Rights and all 27 amendments, and what gives you the power to vote, what gives you the right to vote. All of those amendments are very important. As I finish this up, I want you to know there are always women behind the men, and here are some of those prominent women that were behind the men. And as we look at Alexander Hamilton, you can see his wife, Eliza. Great hairdo, by the way. That is some big hair. Even bigger than what I saw in the 80s. And so you guys can see who she was and what she did. Probably the most famous, yes, Martha Washington there. But of course there's Dolly Madison.